Okay. Well, good afternoon. We are filming this in Ellensburg at the monthly Jural Society meeting. And this talk, I'm titling it, Reforming Washington. And I'm not talking about reforming the government in the way that we're not going to go in there and try and help them to see things from a different point of view and get different people elected. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about reforming something that has been destroyed or vacant. And I will explain that as we get into it. But if you are one of those people, like many of us patriotic people, who have been frustrated by the idea that the Constitution has no effect in Olympia, then I'm going to explain to you why it has no effect. I'm going to explain to you why the courts will never address constitutional issues. They will circumvent them. They will use weasel words to get around it. If you try and hold somebody to a constitutional standard in office, they will never be held. They will be held to the statute, not to the Constitution. And I'll explain to you why. And if you're part of that movement that's trying to reassert the 10th Amendment, I'm going to show you why you're going to fail in that. Because territories do not have equal access and standing in the Constitution. Now, let me start by going through a timeline of events that has occurred in Washington, and it will lead you through a series of historical events, and you will see quite clearly on a timeline why it is that we have to reform Washington if we're going to get back to a constitutional basis for government. Washington, we're going to start with March 2 of 1853. So March 2 of 1853, we have an act of Congress to establish the territory of Washington. It was also referred to as the Organic Act. And I have a copy of it right here. And I won't read it, obviously, but just to show you, and maybe, I don't know if you can scan this onto the... It's readily available at the National Archives. But it was March 2 of 1853, an act to establish the territory of Washington. Now let me just draw a little side note here and talk about the distinctions between a state and a territory. When the Constitution for the United States was formed, it was formed by 13 colonies who fought for independence and achieved it, and then joined together after the Articles of Confederation to form a more perfect union, and they came up with a document we refer to as the Constitution for the United States. Who has standing among the nations to access that treaty, if you will, or that Constitution? Well, it's the members of it, right? Those are the 13 states. Those are the member states of that organization. A territory is governed from afar. A state is governed from within. We're talking about states in the United States here, and states in the United States are republican forms of government that are admitted to this union of states. And they enjoy certain rights and privileges with that. They give up certain rights to the federal government. In exchange, they receive the equal protection of the federal government. They give up the ability to coin their own money. They get a common currency. There's give and take, but it's a member-only arrangement. And so a territory is a creation that doesn't have membership in this union. The concept of territories wasn't part of the Constitution. There was territories in Virginia, I believe, had a territory. West Virginia later became a state. But the territories are mentioned in the Constitution refer only to those territories then. Later on, and it wasn't really until the Louisiana Purchase that Congress had this issue dumped in their lap. They'd already made the purchase, and then somehow somebody said, well, what do we do with it? Where's the constitutional authority for this? And, of course, there was none. And so rather than, give it back to, the purchase, they decided, no, we have the authority. It's under the Necessary and Proper Clause, and it's a doctrine they called in-choate states. I-N-C-H-O-A-T-E, I think, in-choate, or states in the waiting. They said, well, we'll go ahead and we'll govern these territories from D.C., and when the populations of these states achieves a sufficient area to or sufficient size to self-govern, then they can create their own states, petition us for admission into the Union, and then they will become states on an equal footing. Now, we'd already had, before the Louisiana Purchase, states joining the Union on an equal footing. And that's important to understand. They come in on an equal footing. They don't have lesser standing just because they were joined later. And so a territory is governed from afar by Congress, in this case, and a state is self-governing. A state is a self-governing entity. So when we talk about the differences between states and territories, if Washington has the status of a territory, we can expect federal legislation to affect us on a routine basis, which you see. If Washington had the status of a state in its original meaning, we would be immune from most federal legislation. Now, in March 2nd of 1853, one more point on territories. A territory is under the plenary power of Congress. It doesn't have constitutional protection. The people would have inherent rights, but the Constitution does not extend to the territories. So Congress is not bound by the Constitution unless they bring it in by statute. And there's several cases that you could look at to verify that. I will cite one as an authority. It's the Downs versus Bidwell case, if you want to look that up. It's a fairly well-known case. And they spell out some of the issues of states versus territories. Okay. March 2, 1853, an act of Congress to establish the territory of Washington. And I'm going to draw these out so you can see them on the board here. So that was March 2 of 1853. July 27, 1878, a constitutional convention was formed in Walla Walla, Washington, to create a constitution. And they did that, and that was concluded on July 27 of 1878. In November of 1878, I'll draw them up here. Oops. 1878. And this is all in the timeline. Hopefully you'll have this packet with the video as you're watching it. It will be made available. In November of 1878, voters approved the Constitution that was done in that convention. Here's a copy of the Constitution that was done, one of the original copies. And here's a copy of the abstract of election returns that shows, and I won't try and, it's kind of hard to read, but it shows clearly that, in fact, the people did approve the Constitution. And so, from that time forward, from this point forward, who is the sovereign over Washington? It's the people. Because from the time of this vote forward, there's self-government. Now, in the schedule of the Constitution, they spell out the form of government that's to be in effect from this point forward. And that was that the territorial offices would continue until admission. Because the people that wrote this Constitution had in their mind that the function of the state would be to join the Union. They didn't want to just to be an independent state. They wanted to be part of the Union. And so they spelled out that the territorial offices would continue until admission. Now, those territorial offices did not exist anymore under the authority of the federal government. They existed under the authority of the state government. But they looked the same. Because you see why? The sovereignty has changed. From this point forward, the people are self-governing. And so the territorial offices that existed prior to that transformed from being under the plenary power of Congress to being under the power of the self-governing people of Washington. And that's what self-government's all about. Now, not much happened with that up until January of 1889. So several years passed. We have January of 1889, and there's some time here between that, almost 10 years, and the people of Washington decided to come together again and to rededicate themselves to this goal of achieving statehood and admission. They've already got statehood, but they haven't got admission. So in 1889, they have an admissions convention in Ellensburg. And I have here a flyer that came from the Ellensburg Chamber of Commerce, I believe, showing that from January 3 through January 7 in 1889, there's this admission convention. And there's a week-long speakers and games and stuff with the whole idea of bringing people together and stirring up this statehood movement again. And so that's what they did. Now, Mr. Voorhees, who was the representative from Washington Territory, remember we didn't have congressional membership yet because we're not part of that union. They have territorial representation. He travels from here, and I'm not sure if he was, I'm pretty sure he was at the convention, but he goes from Washington back to D.C. after this convention takes place in Ellensburg, and on January 28, he presents a petition to Congress for admission to the Union. So in January 3 through 7, we have this event in Ellensburg. In January 28th, shortly thereafter, Mr. Voorhees, back in the District of Columbia, presents a petition for admission to the Union. That petition ultimately wound up as being published under Senate Bill 185. And I have a copy of that here. January 28, 1889, presented by Mr. Voorhees, referred to Committee on Territories in order to be printed to accompany Senate Bill number 185. This is a copy of the state constitution. This one, the one done in Walla Walla in 1878, was printed by the Senate Bill 185 after we were admitted into the Union. And see, from this point on, we're a member of the Union. We're stayed here, we're a member of the Union here. Now, why is this Constitution not the one that governs Washington today? Why is this Constitution sitting back in archives while they display a different Constitution on the Capitol building, and they follow neither one? Well, this is where the fraud kicks in. According to the schedule of the Constitution, after this event occurred, which was the admission, it says the Tuesday next, following the 6th Monday after admission, the election required to seat the offices of the Walla Walla Constitution pursuant to Section 17 of the schedule. So in this schedule that's attached to the Constitution and part of it, under Section 17, they say that the 6th Monday after admission, so from this date forward, if you count 6 Mondays after that, the election is to be followed on the next Tuesday. Okay, so that would put you at about 6 to 7 weeks after this day, we should be having an election. That failed to occur. The territorial government, specifically the office of the Secretary of the Territory, he breached his duty. He did not do what the law required. Instead, on August 22nd of 1889, so here we go from January all the way down to August here. In August 22nd, 1889, a second convention is convened in Walla Walla. Actually, the 22nd is when the convention adjourned. It had been going on for a few weeks.